All right, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Let's make a start. Thank you to everyone for attending on time, and we'll make a start and open the event. So just to start off with, Palestine is obviously a place and a cause that means a lot to all of us. That's why we're here at this event. And none of you need to be told the crimes that have been committed against them. You're all here at this event because you understand that Palestine's struggle against Zionism is a struggle for justice. What is less known or understood is just how widespread that injustice is. And the aim of today's event is to lay out clearly the injustices of Zionism and Islamophobia, the clear and inherent link between them, and why Muslims must tackle one to defeat the other and how to do so. So before we begin, just to explain the format and the ground rules. So each of our speakers will talk for about 15 minutes. And then we will end the event with a Q&A. The event should take up to an hour. If the Q&A is engaging, we may extend it for about 10 minutes. The chat, the text chat, is for submitting questions that we will try to answer in the Q&A at the end. Please keep the chat clear for those questions. Anyone who instigates and feeds debates in the chat will be removed. For those watching on our Facebook live stream, we will try to get to your questions after the event attendees' questions, again, time permitting. So let's get straight into this. Our first speaker is Stanley Cohen. Based in New York, he was a legal attorney for Hamas for 20 years and for bin Laden's son-in-law. He's also represented Hezbollah and members of Al-Shabaab, as well as the Black Liberation Army and the IRA, and the hacktivist group Anonymous. He's also led talks for the attempted release of ISIS's hostage Abdurrahman Peter Kasich. He's a long-standing supporter of Palestine and the dispossessed and oppressed. Zionists hate him, and therefore it gives me great pleasure to introduce Stanley Cohen.
Thank you all. I'm honored to be invited to this wonderful gathering at 5:30 in the morning in the Eastern Standard Time, but I'm thrilled to be here. Let me say there are three things that are going on, and it's almost as if there's divine intervention, because as we're sitting here, and I'm thinking about, okay, how am I going to introduce this? I get a notice from Twitter that a report has been filed against me in Germany, which was rejected, because yesterday I posted a tweet about a Palestinian woman who's about to give birth and has been chained to her bed. She's in a detention center. She's not been charged. She's not been prosecuted. She's not been convicted. And my post was simply chaining a Palestinian mother to her bed as she goes into labor. Perfectly normal, because it facilitates infants' familiarity with the security of life. So essential to concentration camps, Israel. So it was a combination of snark, of political reality and life, and typically the response was, we have to file a complaint that's from the self-hating Jew, and it's anti-Semitic, and it was safe enough politically that Germany said no. So there's that. The second issue is I awakened this morning to a tweet from someone who I respect, but went on to try to explain how Robert Kennedy was essentially killed by Israel, assassinated by Israel, because he wanted them to register with FARA. As if, Israel, which is this Machiavellian masterpiece in a dark way at survival, at pushing and promoting, and which never quite got over its attack on the US vessel, is going to assassinate one of the most popular figures in the world in order to avoid a ministerial compliance in the United States that would have had no impact on AIPAC, that would have had no impact on the influence and the lobby of Zionists in the United States. And the accusation by itself sort of plays into the notion, you see, this is why they hate us so much. So there's a fine line between being critical, being objective, being real, being targeted, and going after them. When I say them, I just don't mean Jews. I'm talking about Zionism. I'm talking about those who promote Islamophobia, and those that think it furthers the agenda by railing and raving and throwing everything up in the air. Like last week, I heard JFK was assassinated because he was trying to stop Israel from getting nuclear weapons, as if the United States would be opposed to Israel getting the nuclear weapons or any other weapon to represent its interest. The third aspect of this discussion that's so timely is myself and a group of international lawyers are about to file another action, fairly creative. You'll have to sit with bated breath for a few days to see where it's going and why. But part of it is to draw out and flesh out, and I don't call it an international cabal because it's very much plain for everyone to see, the nexus, as you've been talking about, between Israel and Zionism and the rest of the world. Wherever there is a despot, wherever there is a colonial power, wherever there is a machinery of state that disappears, that tortures, that assassinates, that corrupts entire communities to further its own end, you're going to see Zionism, you're going to see Israel throughout its history. Whether it's in Africa in the early days of apartheid in South Africa, whether it was supporting guns with Rwanda and Angola and Uganda, whether, we talk about Idi Amin, who they very quietly, not so quietly, provided weapons to, whether it is with Pinochet in Latin America, whether it was Duarte in the Philippines, whether it is, now the Abraham Accords with those great progressive Muslim states of Bahrain, the UAE, and with KSA, whether it's the history with the Shah, what clearly has been established for more than 73 years, and part of this, the effort in this lawsuit we're about to begin with, is I had to go back and research the history, going back to the early 19th century, going back to the Bar Jara settlers, the Hashmonas Zionist farms in Russia, the Jewish Legion, the Mule veterans, all these different iterations of Zionist movements in the early 20th century, in the early 19th, the mid 19th century, that were designed for one purpose alone. And that was to exploit, that was to arm, that was to expand, and it was to seize. So some things change and other things remain more sophisticated. Now, in that light, in that discussion, we were talking about this earlier today. A year ago, when Corbyn was under attack by the anti-Semitic fraternity in the UK, where people walked into debate and bought debate, I sent a message, take them on in court, challenge them, let the air expose the stench, be very public, because you can't break bread with these folks silently. I fought, and we won against the South African Jewish Board of Directors in South Africa over an attack on radio station 789, which was basically at its core an Islamophobic attack. You have to confront based on fact, and you don't have to create fiction. There is abundant evidence over the last 150 years of not just a covert, an overt effort by Zionists. Suddenly a 3,000 or 4,000 year old religion, which was just, I guess, floating around waiting to be saved, all of a sudden ends up being saved by a group of secular Europeans in the mid 19th century. So the notion of oneness, of Zionism conflates with Judaism, and it all conflates with Israel and the world, and they speak for the Jews of the world, or they speak for those of the world that were Jewish or practiced the faith and no longer do. This is not by accident. There's nothing surreptitious, there's nothing covert about it. Israel and Zionists have taken a very clear look. How do we sell this? How do we empower ourselves? How do we expand our hold? And in this day and age, the attack on Islam plays into it 100%, because we always in the West need the boogeyman. So the boogeyman today is Islam. The boogeyman today is this movement, is this theology that's thousands of years of age, that's based upon love and faith, but self-determination, which is a core for any faith or any movement, has suddenly become the enemy, and it sells. So, Zionists worldwide, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's confronting and attacking BDS in the United States, whether it's criminalizing people in Latin America for their speech, for their assembly, for their identity, is not by accident. But nor is it this group of Jewish space lasers from Northern California or JFK junior conspiracies. Because if we maintain that focus, if we get locked into conspiracy theories, if we get saddled with carrying the baggage of the same time-failed claims, we're destined to fail. We've got to keep focused. We've got to keep identified. We've got to use our speech. We've got to use our association. And as I said to an advisor to Corbyn last year, you need to challenge this in court. The stench of Zionism cannot survive the clean air, the light of day. You challenge it. That's why you have courts. That's why you have historians. That's why you have journalists. That's why you have litigators. The facts are abundant. The way you deal with truth is facts. The way you deal with facts is putting it out there. Yes, there are times where there is a clear line between the Zionist agenda, the international collective, to usurp the discussion, to control it and divert it, and they themselves propagate these bizarre Mossad myth and counter myth and triple myth. But we need to stay focused. History, facts, truth, reality is on our side. And today, throughout the world, we are beginning to see the kind of pushback that Israel and Zionism has never faced before. It's a younger generation of women and men. It is a younger generation of political activists. It is a younger generation of people engaged in self-determination, in national liberation in Palestine, in Africa, in Latin America, and to some degree in other Western states. And collectively, if we keep our focus, we deal with facts, we deal with history, we confront them whenever we can, not with conspiracy theories, but with reality, we have a chance of pushing back even further. When people ask me, a journalist the other day asked me how I was feeling right about now. It's a terrible situation. And I'll give you an example. There's a young woman from Gaza who is translating a bunch of declarations for me for this lawsuit last night. And she's not in Gaza right now. She's been outside of Gaza for 4 or 5 years, attending university. And I apologized because how incredibly painful the interpretation of these declarations are, which relate back to just this past May, and having gone through 3 attacks and her home being destroyed and family and friends assassinated. And the message she sent was, it's okay, we must do this. And that at the end of the day is what this is about. It is important to understand the Zionist agenda. It is important to understand that at its core is Islamophobia. It is important to understand that Israel does not own the United States, that it serves as a dutiful, obedient proxy in the Middle East and has for a long time. It is important to beat them, not with myth. It is important to beat them, not with conspiracy. It is important to beat them with their vulnerability. And their vulnerability is, for 135 years, they have represented the most blatant, the most overt, and the most damning terrorist unbroken network we have encountered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stanley, for putting that so eloquently. We now have with us Professor Ilan Pappé. He is the director of the European Centre of Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter, and he is the author of 20 books, among them The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and On Palestine with Noam Chomsky. He was born in Haifa in 1954 and gained his PhD from the University of Oxford in 1984. He taught at the University of Haifa until 2006 and moved to teach in Exeter thereafter. It gives me great pleasure to host Professor Ilan at our event today.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to share the podium with Stanley and with all of you. And thank you very much for thinking about me and inviting me to this very important discussion on a topic that usually is either not discussed at all or is only discussed marginally, while it should be a very important part on the discussion on Palestine and its future. Let me begin by saying that everything that I would say here does not meant to claim that Zionism is an ideology or Israel as a state is the worst example of human brutality or inhumanity. The main aim, and I think this should be the aim, and this is the main problem we have with Zionism in Israel, is to challenge the exceptionalism that Zionism as an ideology and Israel as a state enjoys despite its criminal policies on the ground in the past and in the present. Exceptionalism like that provides a shield for Israel that enables it to continue the oppression of the Palestinians, which really is a daily occurrence against Palestinians wherever they are in the last century and even longer than that. Islamophobia, in this respect, for me at least, explains, not alone with other factors, the power of this shield. Islamophobia is an important ingredient in this shield of immunity that protects Israel from international condemnation or from any action that could have been taken in the past and should be taken in the future to prevent the continued oppression of the Palestinians on the ground. Dismantling the shield, for me, is a sacred mission. And therefore, I have to analyze as an activist and as a scholar the part that Islamophobia plays in this shield. And as I say, it's not the only component, but it's an important component. The second thing I want to preface my short intervention in this very important webinar is that because Islamophobia is part of this shield of immunity that enables Israel to do what it does, Muslims, and we know it from Britain, who support Palestine are regarded as endangering the validity of this immunity. And they face, once they, for whatever reason, as human beings, as Muslims, as Arabs, as British citizens or American citizens, with a modicum of decency in them, they voice their disgust at what Israel is doing. They voice their clear support for the Palestinian struggle. They are facing a powerful coalition that protected Zionism in the past and protects Israel in the present. And this is not a meager coalition. This includes the powerful members of the EU, Britain, the West, the multinational corporation, the military industry, and lately, unfortunately, countries like India and some Arab countries have also joined into this powerful coalition that is in many ways committed to maintain the shield of exceptionalism that allows Israel to do what it does on the ground. So if you are, as a Muslim in Britain, let's say, or anywhere else, engage in any way with the Palestine question, you are immediately affected by this coalition. And allegedly, actually, if you want to prevent being assaulted and attacked by that coalition, you should not refrain from speaking openly about Palestine. But of course, once you refrain from speaking openly about Palestine, more alarmingly, you might find yourself not being able to speak on anything, not only about Palestine, which means that there is a connection between the role Islamophobia plays in protecting Israel and the struggle for equality of Muslims in Britain and in the West. And as I don't know how many of you are familiar, and if not, go and buy the book. If you are familiar with Nadine El-Enani's book called Bordering Britain, which actually, she calls it bordering, but she puts in brackets the word ordering. So it's both bordering Britain, but it's also ordering Britain. I think, Stanley, you'll be particularly interested in this book because it's written by a jurist. And it shows that Britain is still still is stuck in the colonialist era, not just mentally, but also legally. And thus decolonizing Palestine would lead to decolonizing Britain and vice versa. And the fight against Islamophobia is an important struggle for the decolonization, not just of Palestine, but also of other parts of the West. So let me, with these kind of initial remarks, go to a brief explanation. How do I see the evolvement of Islamophobia in protecting Zionism in Israel, and I will do it very briefly so we have enough time to hear the important questions and comments. The first thing to remember is that Zionism didn't start as a Jewish project. It started as a Christian evangelical project. That's very important to remember. It preceded Jewish Zionism and was connection in the minds of evangelical Christians to the redemption of Palestine. The return of the Jews was seen as something that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead. In this vision, of course, the Jews were to be shish kebab in hell unless they would convert to Christianity. And in this respect, this powerful theological Christian movement was also anti-Jewish in many ways, because it wanted the Jews to return to Palestine in order to precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, but at the same time, they wanted to get rid of the Jews who lived in their vicinity. So it was kind of a double bill for them in this respect. But there is also an element of Islamophobia in this early beginnings of Zionism as a political project, as I stress, which began in Christianity, not in Judaism. And this was the fact that this was strongly connected to the idea that the Western Christian world needs to redeem the Holy Land after the Crusaders lost it in the medieval times. So while anti-Semitism was the major driving force for supporting the right, for the return of the Jews to Palestine and later the colonization of Palestine, it was coupled and infused with Islamophobia, as we shall see in the next kind of instances where the two connect together in the future. The early notions of the first group of the Jewish settlers, when Zionism became a Jewish political project and became a settler colonial project in Palestine, if you look at the early notions that these settlers had, or even when they were still activists before colonizing Palestine, I think today we will call their images and perceptions of the Palestinians as Orientalist in the way that Edward Said described the reductionist and racist perceptions of anyone who was Oriental in the West. But I think more focusedly, in the case of the Zionists, they're not just talking about the Orients or the Arabs. They keep using the term Muhammadins, namely the Muslims. And it's a mixture of ignorance of what Islam is, and more importantly, for our case, totally disregard for the civilizational role Islam played in Palestine in the past. And you can see how racist attitudes to Muslims for just being Muslims are kind of interjected with the overall dehumanization of the indigenous population, which is a very typical attitude of settler colonial movements. Mohammedans is also something that was used by the British policymakers who supported the idea of turning Palestine from an Arab and Muslim country into a Jewish state. If you read the memoirs of Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time that Britain granted the Balfour Declaration in 1917, giving something it didn't belong to someone it didn't belong to, the land of Palestine. He also talks about the need to redeem Palestine that was lost by the Crusaders. And he also says, I would rather have a Jewish colony than a Muhammadan, or namely a Muslim colony as part of the expanded British Empire, with the hope that they will take over the provinces that in the Arab world until then were part of the Ottoman Empire. And this repeats itself in the ceremonies that accompany the British occupation of Palestine. The famous entry of General Allenby to Jerusalem is rehearsed and enacted as a redemption of Jerusalem from the hands of the Muslims and bringing it back to the embrace of Christianity. During the mandatory period, both the pro-Zionist British officials and the Zionist ideologues and activists kept looking at the justified anti-colonialist struggle of the Palestinians against the colonization of Palestine. They tried to depict it as part of an Islamic war against Jews and Christians, wherever they are, and use this as a very valid very effective propaganda to galvanize, at least in Britain, public opinion to support the continued colonization and dispossession of the Palestinians. If you look at the reality after the creation of the State of Israel, you can see that Islamophobia and racism against Arabs in general, but this is always conflated with racism against Muslim, is also at the heart at the period when Britain was unconditionally the ally of Israel, which led to the 1956 Suez campaign. I'm old enough, although I only read it as a historian, but if you go over the British newspapers around the attack on Egypt in 1956, you can see how the idea of Arab nationalism, anti-colonialist movement in the Arab world, and the support for Israel are all wrapped in an anti-Islamic discourse. So these things are not separated. They're all part of the same kind of racism that is meant to justify anti-democratic and brutal actions against the Arab world and against the Palestinians at the time where supposedly colonialism should have come to an end. Parallel in America, a bit later on in the 1980s and the 1990s, we encounter a different kind in the way that Islamophobia is integrated into protecting the Israeli criminal policies against the Palestinians. The evangelical priests, which we call Christian Zionists, together with the Israeli lobbyists, the pro-Israeli lobbyists in AIPAC, may try to produce this very simplified picture that support for Israel is support against Islamic terrorism, Islamic barbarism, and again, people are not fully aware of the implications later on, not only for the fact that an important section of the American public opinion gives backing to sinister American policies of support to Israel, and not just against the Palestinians, but against many of the neighboring Arab states, but that this also sows the seeds of venomous seeds of hatred and racism against American Muslims. And you cannot separate anymore these racist attitudes from the policy of unconditionally supporting Israel. And this, of course, is amplified after 2001, identifying first Islam with terror, then identifying Islam with Palestinian terrorism, delegitimize, and an attempt, which, thank God, did not succeed because so many people in civil society did not accept it. But the attempt was to delegitimize the struggle, the anti-colonialist struggles for liberation of the Palestinian by equating it with terrorism and then equating Islam with terrorism. This is the time when Israeli security experts are invited all over the world to help them deal with Islamic terrorism. There was a famous incident in the late 1990s, not an incident, an occurrence, when an Israeli minister by the name Israel Katz was interviewed in Belgium. And he said that he was invited by the Belgian government because Israel knows how to deal with millions of Muslim terrorists, and Belgium only has a small number of them, so he can easily help them to deal with this. This insidious, insane kind of discourse is legitimized by academics, institution, and so on. I'm running out of time, so let me just conclude by saying Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and manipulation of anti-Semitism, weaponizing it in order to defend Israel, are at the heart of the idea of Zionism. And a constant attempt to associate terrorism and Islam and the Palestinian struggle is meant to create fear of Muslims that can be conveyed to fear from Palestinians in order to shield, to conceal the inhumanity on the ground. So what can we do in 2 sentences? I think we have to rewrite a new genealogy, which is not there in academia, not there in the media, not there in the educational system. We have to rewrite a new genealogy of the relationship between Muslim and Jews over the years. We need to dispel the ignorance about Islam, give a clearer information about Zionism and why the 1975 United Nations resolution equating it with racism is valid still today. Make sure that people understand the difference between Judaism and Zionism, and really also expanding the notion of Islam, not just to explain it as a faith and religion, but also as a civilization. The Jews and Christians, and not just Muslims, felt an organic in it, an integral part of it. And this is the vision for the future. It's not just a reconstruction of the past. This is the only way Jews, Muslims, and Christians would be able to live together in a free Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ilan, for that comprehensive and historical context. Just a reminder that, if you have questions for Professor Ilan and Stanley, they've unpacked, hopefully started to unpack a lot of thoughts and a lot of ideas and a lot of questions. So please do post those questions in the chat, and we will do our best to get to them after this part, my part of the event. So getting into this, so thanks to our knowledgeable and experienced speakers, we now know a lot more about Zionism and its strategic connections to imperialism, Islamophobia, and everything else that is hurting Muslims. But it's not enough to just know what is happening. We need to know what needs to happen next. What are the practical steps that every Muslim in the UK can do to do their bit to undermine Zionism? Now, nobody should leave this event thinking that they cannot do anything. So I'm going to use my time to give as wide a breadth of ideas as I can. And if we need to go into depth for a specific point, we can do so in the Q&A at the end. The first thing we have to do is to understand how the opponent thinks. Zionism is a perspective. It's a way of looking at the world, and it pulls together people who have a wide variety of backgrounds, but who are united in that perspective. Once you understand that perspective, you understand that Zionism leads to Islamophobia. The simplest way to demonstrate this to you guys is obviously with examples. So let's start off with Tommy Robinson. Every UK Muslim in this audience has heard of this Islamophobe. He's been bankrolled for years by Robert Shillman, who has senior positions in the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces and the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I'll come back to the DHFC, but back to Tommy first. He's been publicly defended by US Republican politician Samuel Brownback, who threatened to get Trump to criticize the UK when Tommy was in prison. That's the depth of his support for Tommy and the connections he has. Brownback is also an open supporter of the Israeli National Union, National Religious Party Alliance, which openly demands annexation and ethnic cleansing of all Arabs from the West Bank. They're lovely people otherwise, I'm sure. Another backer of Tommy is Middle East Forum, who said they were heavily involved in his release from prison. I will come back to MEF shortly. The last supporter of Tommy I want to mention is Rebel News, whose founder, Ezra Levant, has shown to be willing to put money into any reporter or story as long as they are willing to say negative things about Muslims. This may also explain why Rebel News are linked with Katie Hopkins, who is also listed as a Shillman Fellow of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. So DHFC is linked to Tommy and Katie, but also to Jihad Watch of Robert Spencer fame. Let's look at another Islamophobe, Rahim Kassam. He was supported and employed by Breitbart News, which was founded by Andrew Breitbart and Larry Solov, who visited Israel in 2007 and pledged to be unapologetically pro-Israel. Kassam has also been employed by the Henry Jackson Society, who in turn have been financially supported by the likes of Harold Calmes, a former treasurer of the UK Conservative Party, who has actually attacked Tory MPs who criticize Israel. And he himself is linked to United Against Nuclear Iran, which is pro-war in general and pro-Israel specifically. Henry Jackson Society has also received funds from Nina Rosenwald, who has described herself as an ardent Zionist and has been a director of AIPAC, and is the founder of the Islamophobic Gatestone Institute and has served on the board of the Middle East Forum. Okay, so that's a lot to take in. And in all honesty, I've only presented to you a small snapshot of the Zionist-backed Islamophobia industry. I could have gone further, but there's enough here to demonstrate that Islamophobia and Zionism are intrinsically linked. It's not hypothetical, it's not theoretical, it's not conspiratorial, it's actually happening. And remember, I'm not showing you this because I want you to feel defeated before you've even started. The only reason I'm showing you this is because you can only start dismantling a machine if you understand how it fits together. And when you look at this diagram, you shouldn't see some kind of unbreakable wall. All of these individuals and organizations are simply separate bricks that are stronger when they are together. Zionism is the mortar that keeps those bricks together. Zionism is the perspective, the way of looking at the world that unites these people. So what I want you to understand from this is just to reflect. As supporters of Palestine, or at the very least as Muslims in the UK, do we not have our own bricks, our own individuals and institutions that could be built up with the right kind of mortar, namely a simple desire for justice? Dear Muslims, we cannot defeat Islamophobia without defeating the injustice that is Zionism. If you choose to ignore Zionism, you choose to make the world a more dangerous place, not just for your children, but for every Muslim who comes after you and the future generations of your children and of Muslims who will come after us. They have that right upon us, that right that we do whatever we can within our capabilities to make the world a safer place for Muslims and to be a Muslim. So now that we understand why Zionism must be defeated, let's start thinking about how. The very first step before anyone can act is to be informed. How can we do so? I'm just going to quickly go through these ideas, but obviously there are many people in this audience who are even more creative than I am. Please do put down your thoughts in the chat and we can discuss them in the Q&A or after the event. So events, obviously you can attend events like this one, which not only gives information, but can help you join the dots and see the bigger picture. In terms of academia, you can also follow and absorb the work of academics like our guest here, Professor Ilan, or even choose to go into academia yourself. Activists, there's also the work of activists like our guest Stanley Cohen, whose 20 years as a legal attorney for Hamas has given him an understanding of the Zionist machine that most can only have nightmares of. Independent media and journalists. There are plenty of journalists and media outlets who are independent of manipulative funding and can give up-to-date developments depending on their specific area of focus, whether it's on the ground in Palestine or in the halls of power. Social media, there are plenty of people who don't fall into these neat categories, but they can still be found on social media. But obviously, you know, take this with a pinch of salt. Don't become a victim of misinformation, as Stanley was so careful to point out. And joining an organization, being a member of an organization is the most straightforward way. Like joining MPACUK, which enables you to take in information, discuss it with your teammates, and therefore absorb it and understand it further. Now, becoming an advocate is an ongoing process that never ends. No one is, you know, the final expert at being an advocate against Zionism, but this is a necessary step because it sets you up for the next part of the process, which is to become advocates. Don't just sit on the information you have now gained. Get it out there confidently, and get it out there in any way that you can. I'm going to go through some ideas briefly, but like I said, some of you are very creative and can advocate in ways I can't even imagine. So social media posts, the simplest way to start is by posting on social media. If you don't have social media, perhaps, you know, you're having conversations on your WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal groups. Contacting MPs, another way to advocate is by contacting your MP. This can be done by email, and some MPs have actually said that a physical letter, an old school physical letter, is pretty persuasive. And of course, you can meet them for an appointment as well. Letter writing to papers. So speaking of writing letters, you can also write in to most national or local papers. Calling into local radios. So if you're more of a radio person, you could call in when they have a caller discussion, and creating and sharing videos. So of course, if you have a camera, which most of us do now, you could create and share your own videos. And again, membership of an organization. I'm going to point out again that joining an organization like MPACUK will train you and give you access to the tools and platforms and ideas that you might not otherwise have. Now, why is this step so important? Why is it so important to become an advocate and not just hold on to the information that you've absorbed? Because becoming an advocate gets you well on the way to the next key step. We have to abnormalize Zionist organizations. We have to make it not normal to work with organizations that support the occupation and oppression of Palestine. And each of us in our weekly normal lives come across plenty of public institutions that have normal working relations with Zionist organizations. So starting with the most well-known method of abnormalizing Zio organizations is boycotts, which is basically about shaming businesses for enabling the Zionist agenda. Schools and colleges were under the microscope recently after Israel's attacks on Gaza in May, and UK students' organic reaction and revulsion to this. And after this, the UK Minister of Education himself, Gavin Williamson, who happens to publicly support Israel, sent letters to schools and colleges and told them to work with Zionist organizations to give a more balanced teaching of the Israel-Palestine occupation. Universities, I'm putting universities separately to schools and colleges because their fight to support Palestine and oppose Zionism has been going on for much longer and is pretty distinct in its own right. But in short, if you're a university student, then join that fight. Madrasas, if there are any parents or older siblings in here, push your madrasa to teach about what's going on in Palestine. And for mosques, you know, they love to get involved in interfaith work, which is great, but hold them to account in terms of who they're partnering with. And, you know, get your imams to talk about Palestine, get your committees to invite expert guests, and also get us in touch with them, and we can collaborate on upcoming campaigns and projects. And again, joining an organization like MPACUK will give you the training and opportunities to do all of the above and then some. So, okay, quick reflection here. Obviously, this is all a huge amount of effort. What is the end goal? What are the milestones that will tell us if we're getting close to any kind of victory. There is only one way to know if we're winning against Zionism, and that's by joining that battlefield we all commonly call politics. Before I get into this, let's reflect again on the very first step about understanding our opponent's perspective. Zionism is a way of looking at the world, and that is to look at the world with Israel right in the center of everything. And for Zionists to ensure that others work towards that goal, the way leaders run their communities must have their own priorities hijacked or brought into line with Zionism. And influencing the way a country is run is, what is that called? It's called politics. Zionists obviously have their own reason for believing in their cause. Those reasons may be, quote unquote, religious or economic or just groupthink. But in terms of a movement that is trying to redirect entire governments to absorb the Zionist perspective, that redirection and influencing is called politics. That's what the process is called. And as I showed at the start, and as our speakers have pointed out so eloquently, Islamophobia is clearly being used as a tool to redirect politicians' policies and bring all of them onto the same page. You can choose to ignore the power of politics, just like you can choose to ignore the power of the ocean current. But when a tsunami hits you, all the people you love, everybody's getting destroyed all the same. It's undeniable that Zionism is inherently political and inherently Islamophobic. So therefore, if we want to land the winning blow on this Zionism and Islamophobia, this is the final battlefield we must work towards and gain victory in. So starting at a small scale, we have to oppose Islamophobic and Zionism-friendly statements and actions. We have to call these out to stop the normalization of Islamophobia, which is what Zionism feeds off of, as Professor Ilan pointed out. Mayoral elections, stepping up in scale, we have to be involved in campaigns for or against mayors, depending on the candidates' friendliness to Zionism. There are plenty of other types of elections to get involved in, but this is the basic idea. And once you understand how important it is to Zionists that their supporters gain political power, you can never look at the general election in the same way again. I've already mentioned Gavin Williamson, for example, the Minister of Education and an open supporter of Israel. Thanks to him, every parent here now has another reason to be anxious about their Muslim children being targeted by the authorities at school. We have to defeat Zionists on this battlefield. And finally, yet another reminder that nobody can achieve any of this alone. Join an organization like MPACUK. So this may sound like we've reached the final step that you guys can participate in to help defeat Zionism, but there is in fact one more step, and probably the most pragmatic step of all. Fund all of the above. Nothing is sustainable without money. If we want to beat a well-funded machine, we need our own functioning and funded machine. The thing to remember here is that, sure, you might not have the time to regularly do any of the things that I've just talked about, but you can still support the work. You might want to donate one-off, for example, in Ramadan or in the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah or your Zakat. You may want to set up a regular donation. If you don't have the funds yourself, you could fundraise for these organizations. And if you actually have experience in fundraising or writing grant applications or running fundraising events, then join and feed in your organizations. And I'll say this for the final time, if you see an organization that you want to support, even if you can't give them the time, but you want to find out other ways to support it, join it anyway and start that conversation. So in summary, if you've already forgotten everything I've just said, remember these three goals: unite, organize, institutionalize. Why is it important to unite? Because one organization or one person will not defeat Zionism by themselves. Zionists are working hand in hand with Islamophobes to progress their goals. And likewise, Muslims must unite with each other and with allies to win against Islamophobia and Zionism. What does it mean to be organized? Once you have a group of people together, you're going to have lots of ideas and resources that need to be prioritized in a way that works for everyone and gets us closer to our shared goal. And if we want each of our successes, no matter how small or large they are, if we want our steps towards victory to remain even after we have gone, we have to create and join and maintain the institutions that will carry on this vital work. We must institutionalize this course. We have to stitch it into our society. So if you agree with some or most, or hopefully all that you have heard today, join MPACUK, just fill out the volunteering form. There should be a link in the chat now or shortly, or perhaps donate. There should be a link to that too. So I'm going to take some questions now. What is the best reading material on the origins of Zionism in terms of the Christian evangelical settler colonial project? What's the best reading material out there on that?
Well, I'm actually in the middle of writing a book called Lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic. So you'll have to wait for the book and read the chapter because it's the first time I think anyone has analyzed systematically the connection between Christian Zionism and its early form and Zionism. So I do hope you'll be patient enough. The book will come out very soon. But if the person would like to email me, I can suggest some articles and so on. I don't want to waste the time of the discussion by giving particularly names of articles and so on. But there is not as yet one in one place which led me to write the book, because I like the person who asked the questions, I felt that this is a lacune that has to be filled.
Let me add one thing. As an attorney and as an activist, I've handled cases throughout the United States for 30 years. I've traveled extensively in the South of the United States, in the Midwest, the Northwest, which is really the linchpin of the Christian Zionist movement. The biggest advantage we have is their stupidity. They are very big on talisman, on chant, on this incantation. It's sort of like, delicing to fight off COVID. That their weakness is fact, truth, reality. Their weakness is whenever they are engaged, once you get beyond the mystical arms of 600 years ago, and you get into the heres, you get into the nows, you get into the reality of what is happening on the ground, they lose. So there is the academic perspective, which is essential, but the other answer, and in terms of how do we confront them, is fact, reality, truth, statistics, data, ongoing history, not 200 years ago, but last week. They can't survive against the reality of truth.
Thank you for that. Another good question that we've had. The Zionist movement has worked hard to center the debate on Zionism. How can we normalize the open discussion and debate of its ideology? Do you guys have any thoughts that we haven't already covered?
Just one thought, I think, which I think we covered, but just to stress it. I think it's very important to stress the fact that, and I think Stanley said it as well, that people would like to regard our opinions as merely opinions, that these are just our wishful thinking or our moral positions, as if there is no way, in a scholarly way or a legal way, to prove that what we say is valid. And I will just give one small example, and I think this will help. For years, people said that if you call Zionism colonialism, or if you blame Israel for committing ethnic cleansing in 1948, well, this is your political opinion and you're entitled to it. I think one thing I contributed to is by saying, no, this is not my political opinion. This is the truth. It's not my interpretation of what happened. This is what happened. So we're talking about crimes not things that might appear to some people as crimes, you know? And this is what liberal Zionists are very good at doing. They said, okay, you can see it as a crime, but there's a possibility of not seeing it as a crime. No, no, no. And that's why liberal Zionism disappeared, because even people who support Israel said this is not going to work. So I think it's very important to understand and to continue. And you're right in asking people to join research and so on, that we have a valid proof to our the things that we say about Zionism in Israel. It does not come out of hatred. It's not doesn't come out of anti-Semitism. I think it's very important. That's where we're going to win. We're going to win if people would understand that we reflect the reality, we show the reality for what it is, while the people who blame us of being racist and anti-Semites are actually themselves racist and so on. When it comes to the truth, the Palestinians have nothing to lose, really.
Let me just add very briefly to this. And as I indicated when I spoke initially, is I'm in the middle, almost at the end of a very extensive brief, a legal analysis, a legal brief. It's 50 or 60 pages. Ultimately, the law is the law, but fact cannot be, you know, you can count angels on the head of a pin all day long, but fact is fact. And this is a brief that beginning 130 years ago, right through last week, is based upon undeniable fact, events, occurrences, not extrapolation, quotations around words from Zionist leaders, from leaders in Israel, from support groups, fact, their own words, their own theology, their own premise. And as long as we are not hiding, as long as we are using, as long as we are projecting, as long as we are relying upon fact, not conspiracy, not myth, not our own political quote unquote agenda or interpretation, we can't be defeated.
When the likes of key influential figures like yourselves speak out against the realities and injustices of Zionism and oppression of Muslims in Palestine, the Zionist media and lobby conduct a character assassination to delegitimize your views. How have you personally overcome this, and what advice would you give to others to ensure that the real voices have the authority that they require and are not silenced?
Well, look, when I tried the Abu Ghraib case, that was bin Laden's son-in-law in the Southern District of New York. The second generation iteration of the JDL, they posted these leaflets, thousands of them, all over the courthouse in the areas. Cohen is a self-hating Jew. Cohen is anti-Semitic. Cohen is this, Cohen is that, Cohen is this. And the federal judge, when it began, said, look, we found these, we're removing them. Do you want security? And I said, I have security. It's called the truth. I don't waste my time debating Zionists. I don't waste my time I've done it I've debated the ambassador of Israel. I've debated David Frum in Doha about Hamas. Yes, periodically I publicly debate when I feel it's important, but by and large, I ignore them. Part of their strategy is to deflect, is to dilute, and is to waste our time. We have fact, we have truth, we have a mission, go forward. Ignore them, leave them alone. If this is a battle for the hearts and souls of going forward, that will be won or lost by facts and truth and not their rhetoric.
In my own case, I think maybe a bit different than Stanley's because I'm an academic.
Yes.
The main tactic used against me was to delegitimize my scholarship. And this continues. Just a week ago, the Haaretz newspaper, the liberal Zionist newspaper, published 5 pages on my lack of scholarship and the fact that I'm a fabricator and so on. Now, when you are in the beginning of your career, you're a bit alarmed when such a thing comes on. When you are at my age and everything I've done so far, you see it as a badge of honor that they decided that you deserve not just 1 page to say how unimportant you are, but they need 6 pages to say how unimportant you are. I think what really kept me all the time strong is the fact that I was not alone. And that I knew that anyone with a modicum of decency understands what I'm talking about, and like Stanley, there's a point where you come and say they are not important. That's why I wrote the ethnic cleansing book. I didn't write it in Hebrew. I mean, it came out now in Hebrew, but I wrote it for the world. I wanted the world to understand, because I know there was someone to talk to in the world. There was no one to talk to in Israel, but there was someone to talk to in the world saying, you don't know the truth about what happened in 48, and it's important you should know it because it affects what you should know about the future. So I think you need to not to be intimidated by this, not to get into their own game, and be at peace with yourself, and understand that if someone can call you until tomorrow a racist, you know yourself whether you are a racist or not. And if you are not, there is nothing they can do to undermine your continued struggle. But I don't want to undermine, I mean, for young, especially young students, and maybe Stanley is not always aware of this, but in British universities, young Muslim students are now targeted by new regulations called under policy called, I know you know about it, Stanley, policy called PREVENT, and the new definition of Holocaust denial. I don't want to undermine it. People's career can be targeted. Students are vulnerable, but I think they all should remember, as you said, we should be united on this. Not just the Muslim community, everybody should be united on this. Fight it legally. I think we are not fighting it legally at all. In this respect, I agree with Stanley. There were so many times that I know we should have taken things to the courts because it was such a stark violations of our basic rights. So easily it intimidates us. But when we're not alone, we should work together, and we have nothing to fear because our motives are pure. It stands from our moral positions, from our decency and humanity, and we are fighting inhumanity and indecency. And when we remember that, I think we can, we can withstand any kind of, what is it? A personal assassination of characters and so on. It's really, now it's like water on a duck. It doesn't really trouble you.
Let me just add one thing, and this goes to what Ilan said. We're at a point in our life, we're closer to the end than the beginning. And you measure your success not by people who love you, but by those who hate you. But when you're starting out, whether it's pursuing your PhD or whether you're trying your case and you're trying, I sued Israel 25 years ago. It was the first lawsuit of its kind, and everyone went, "My God, you're suing Israel!" And I said, "Yeah, okay." I spoke to my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Moses, and he gave me permission to do it, so I'll do it. When you're young, I understand it's difficult. There's a sense of isolation, and there's also a false sense of it being a race. It's not. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Be prepared. It's a long struggle. It's a long journey. There are the days where never let those mountains get too high or those valleys too low. You've got principle. You've got purpose. You've got passion. Dig in. There'll be the times when you go home at night and you smack yourself for saying something you shouldn't have, or you smack yourself for not saying something that you should have. It's okay. There's tomorrow and a new opportunity. So whether you are a young scholar, a young lawyer, a young organizer, keep in mind, we are but a continuum of generations of struggle. After we're gone, it will continue on. And I'm not suggesting that Israel will be around after we're gone to continue on as the nation state, but simply don't get disillusioned. Don't get too sky high. Dig in, stick to your principles, and it will be fine.
Thank you guys for those warm words, and I'm sure that we can return to them when needed. Ilan, Pappé, you mentioned that Zionism roots back to a Christian ideology of the return of the Messiah and was very much against early Judaism beliefs. Do you believe that to some degree this narrative, the end of times eschatology, has also crept into Islamic history and sources with regards to the sacredness of Jerusalem? So in your studies, what have you found in terms of this perspective going into Islamic reading of history as well?
No, I didn't find it. I don't think. I think the way the sacredness of Jerusalem developed in Islamic theology was not connected to the idea of returning or redeeming a homeland. There was a continuum of Muslim presence since the 7th century. And then it made sense that a city like Jerusalem, with all its history, was part of it. So no, I think it's really part of this Judeo-Christian, part of the Judeo-Christian heritage, if you want, that began as a theology, and I have no problem with it. I mean, people can develop their theology and so on. I think the difference between the Islamic approach to it and the Jewish and Christian approach to it is that Zionism, first Christian Zionism and then Jewish Zionism, politicized a faith, weaponized a religion in order to justify the colonization of one particular place. I mean, it's just, I keep thinking about my Palestinian friends being targeted by these two powerful ideologies and being in the way of solving the Christian problem with Judaism and the Jewish problem with Judaism, and they want to solve it all at the expense of the Palestinians. It's just unbelievable. And of course, to that you can enter capitalist interest and strategic interest and so on. And if you know the Palestinians as I do, this is one of the most peaceful nations in the world. They're pastoral, they hate fighting, they really like normal life. They are pious people, many of them, and so on. But they're really, I mean, they try to be normal and natural, and they're faced with this project of dispossession that God knows where they found the energy to be resilient and resisted, given the powers that are against them. I mean, really, we should be in awe to these people who have been, I mean, for 120 years, they are defending their homes. They're not trying to occupy another land. They're not trying to expand. They're not trying to expel anyone. They're not trying to kill anyone. They just try to survive as a natural, normal people, and this is denied to them. And I think this is something that we should understand, and that's why Islam plays a role in Palestine as being part of this natural, organic part of the Arab world and the Muslim world, whereas Christianity and Judaism are used. I'm not saying that they are, but they are used in order to dispossess the Palestinians with the hope that somehow this solves the problem that should have been solved years ago between Christianity and Judaism. I think that this is part, and of course, everything else is built on it. Islamophobia, racism. We didn't even start talking about the connection between racism towards African Americans and Black people, wherever they are, and Zionism. There's also connection there in all forms of racism, all forms of racism. If you have one exceptional racism that is legitimized, you undermine the struggle against any kind of racism.
Thank you for that, Professor Ilan.
And I do apologize that I'm going to leave you.
You have to leave, yeah.
Stanley can stay with you, believe me. You're not losing anything.
I'll try to pick up where you leave off, but it's impossible to substitute for you, Elliot.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And I will be very happy to join you again if you continue this discussion, I think, which is very important.
Thank you.
So
I just want to say thank you for your courage and steadfastness and leadership and please do keep it up for people like ourselves and for the people of Palestine, so we may continue the work that we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored by this. Thank you. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
See you soon. Goodbye. Stanley, how much more time do you have?
Oh, my doctor said about 20 years.
Well,
I'm not worried. Let me just add one thing that Ilan said, which is so true. You know, Palestinians are per capita the most highly educated people in the world. When you take a look at the numbers of master's degrees, PhDs, of literacy, despite the bombings, despite the genocide, despite the mayhem, academia, accomplishment, scholarship has been the linchpin, along with farming and a rural community and family, for time immemorial. And I remember sitting around 25 years ago speaking to the then leader of the political wing of Hamas, and we were talking about armed struggle. And he looked at me and he said, you realize we had to learn how to fight. He said, we don't fight. We historically, we read, we write, we teach, we raise our children, we raise our crops, we have family, we celebrate our faith and our future, but we don't know how to fight in that sense. So and that's why what drives Israel probably crazier than anything, combating balloons from Gaza, criminalizing kites, turning them into nuclear weapons, going after young women and men with stones and with masks. It's a struggle that the West is very much unfamiliar with and can't comprehend. So half the Israeli dynamic is trying to manipulate acts of civil disobedience, acts from the civil community, and to turn them into anti-Semitism, to turn them into Islamic fanaticism, when it really is about principled positions. And again, I've never forgotten, this was the then political leader of Hamas saying we had to learn how to fight, and how true it is.
That is very insightful. Stanley, I'd like your thoughts on this question. How do we begin the process of decoupling the Zionist lobby in UK politics? Corbyn being a prime example of someone who is not a Zionist and how he was hounded out of the office. So you already mentioned, you try to advise them, take these guys to court. Would you be able to explain that a bit further, and maybe more generally, how can we decouple the Zionist lobby from UK politics and the major parties?
Well, look, I'm a lawyer, but my last life as a human being, I was an organizer and a social worker. So I understand well the complexity, the evolution from fighting in the streets to fighting in the courtroom, and they're not disconnected. And that's why applause for your position and your statements about organizing, about being a voice, about challenging, about building bridges. Some of the most important courtroom fights in history have resulted in losses in the short term, but victories in the long term. I believe a strategic error has been made by not challenging the Zionist lobby in the UK, by not going into courtrooms, by not suing people, by not exposing the truth. Because the reality of it is you may end up losing on the pure facts of the law, but the reality of it is when you have the facts, you're going to win. You're going to get judicial decisions that take notice of facts. The more facts you establish, whether you win ultimately on the question of law, the stronger your argument in the street. The more you reduce from the Zionist lobby in the UK, as we did against the South African Jewish Board of Directors in the radio station litigation 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, when you remove their rhetoric, when you remove their screen, when you remove their legitimacy as the arbiters of truth, it locks in a new paradigm of facts and truth that empower people. So my position is in the UK, where you have different laws when it comes to speech, different burdens, where people get prosecuted for so-called hate crimes, where people are sued for libel, is go into courtrooms, litigate. There are a world of expert witnesses. Zionists cannot defeat facts. Facts are sometimes screamed from street corners, but it's not as powerful as it is from the witness stand, where judges themselves for the first time hear things, see things, learn things, understand things, and become part of the public debate, the marketplace of ideas. So it's this marriage of confronting, of activism, and litigation. I suggested that to Corbyn a year and a half ago. I said, look, as long as you keep this in the street, you're going to lose. Even if you lose in the courtroom, you win because there's facts, there's truth, there's reality. And that's my position. It's a marriage of the two that historically, with every political movement for self-determination and for truth, relies upon.
I should point out that Stan, as many people might be able to tell, Stanley isn't in the UK right now. He's actually been with us on this event since 5:30 a.m. his local time. So I'm going to give one more question, and then give Stanley an opportunity to get away from us and perhaps rest. Let's stretch those 20 years to 21 if we can. So the final question I want to give you, the Zionist movement has worked hard to censor the debate on Zionism. How can we normalize the open discussion and debate of its ideology? What are your thoughts on that, Stanley?
Well, again, look, I have a lot of faith in the streets. I have a lot of faith in the courts. I have a lot of faith in scholars. I think it's a combination of all of them. As I said, I've just spent with a group of other lawyers a month, preparing for a brief that we will be filing in an international venue next week. I'd like to think it'll be enlightening because it's based upon fact and truth and history and reality, which can't be ducked. So I think it's a combination of many things. Let me give a special message to lawyers. Not that we're the, when you're in law school, we're taught we're the best, the brightest, the prettiest, the handsome, we're touched. And we're also a bit spoiled, who knows, and brats. But when you choose your calling, or when your calling chooses you, embrace it, welcome it, pursue it, go with it. We have the unique ability, and this goes for young law students, it goes for barristers, it goes for solicitors, it goes for a generation of activists, and it doesn't make us, again, the one way to go, but I'm just speaking to that collective at this point, where we can push the narrative, we develop the skills, we learn to fight the fight better than the other side, and don't be intimidated, take the cases, large and small. Many of the biggest victories are done in private, are done in quiet. People never hear about them, but they are victories. In terms of people in the streets, build coalitions, build movements, go to events, sponsor events, understand and accept you will be vilified, at times even criminalized. None of that swallows principle. None of that softens purpose. None of that changes collective poise. We have on our side momentum and history. We are at a crossroad that I believe, in terms of not just Palestine, but in terms on the attack the last 20, 30, 40 years on Islam, a beautiful religion, a beautiful faith, a beautiful vehicle for truth and humanity. We're moving the corner. We're shifting it. There'll be victories, there'll be losses, there'll be days we'll feel like we're walking on air, and there'll be days when we don't want to leave the bedroom. It's okay. It's all part of the process of evolution, particularly when you're talking about pushing back against Zionism, particularly when you're talking about pushing back against anti-Semitism, particularly when you're talking about pushing back against Islamophobia. There's nothing new with this. I mean, sure, Zionism is a baby move, a geopolitical movement that's 120 years old. But when it comes to attacks on faith, when it comes down to the history of Islam or Judaism, excluding that Zionism, which has nothing to do with Judaism, you're talking about struggles that go back thousands of years. It doesn't mean you wait thousands of years, but it means we keep in perspective who we are not, what our role is, what we can or cannot accomplish. Silence is complicity. That's how I sum this struggle up.
I don't think there's anything I could say that tops that. So I think that's a great way to bring this event and this discussion to a close. Stanley, thank you so much for your time and your enthusiasm, as well as the experience and the information that you've brought to this event. I do hope that you can join us again. This is a kind of an event that we want to repeat over and over again until it's normal to, or it's abnormal to, support Zionism. We're going to keep doing this. Guys, who have attended, please do sign up with MPACUK if this is the kind of event, if this is the kind of cause that you also agree with and want to be a part of. Everything that you've seen, part of this event, the promotion of the event, the running of the event, we depend on volunteers. So please do join up and play your part if you can. Thank you, Stanley. I hope to speak to you soon at the next event, if not sooner.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.
Inshallah.
It's an honor to participate. It's a great program. Your work is just fabulous, and I urge people to support it.